There's a tomb in Valladolid, Spain, that almost nobody visits. It has no flowers, no guards, no name carved in marble the way it should be. And yet, beneath that ground rests a man who traveled more than 6,000 kilometers from the mountains of Persia to change the destiny of the Western world. A man who spoke with kings, who was baptized in one of the most powerful palaces in the world, who abandoned his religion, his family, and his name, and who died on a street in Madrid in a fight he never should have had. This is the story of Uric Beg, the Persian prince the Spanish baptized as Don Juan de Persia. And if you make it to the end of this video, I guarantee you will see the conflict between Spain and Iran that is all over the news right now in a completely different way. If you are interested in the history nobody taught you, subscribe now and hit the bell, because every week we bring exactly the kind of content that textbooks decided to ignore. To understand why a Persian prince ended up dead on the streets of Madrid in the year 1604, we need to go back to the world as it was at the end of the 16th century. And the world at that moment was, in essence, a chessboard with three gigantic pieces moving in every direction at the same time. The Spanish Empire, which controlled much of Europe, almost all of the American continent, the Philippines, and dozens of trade routes across the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire, which dominated from the Balkans to Arabia, from Egypt to the gates of Vienna, and which controlled the Eastern Mediterranean with a fleet that made all its neighbors tremble. And the Safavid Empire, which we know today as Iran, a Shia power that had been born barely 80 years earlier, but had already become the only rival capable of facing the Ottomans on land, in the east, while Spain faced them at sea, in the west. What happened between these three powers over nearly a century is one of the most fascinating and least told stories in world history, because Spain and Persia, two empires that never shared a border, that never faced each other on a battlefield, that had different religions, different languages, cultures that could not have been more different. These two empires needed each other so deeply that they came within reach of changing the course of history. A shared enemy has an extraordinary power to unite those who have absolutely nothing else in common. And the shared enemy of Spain and Persia was the same one, the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. Think about it this way. Imagine you are Philip II, the most powerful king in the Western world in 1570. You have an enormous problem called the Ottoman Empire. The Turks are in the Mediterranean. They are threatening your coastlines in Italy and Spain. They are attacking your allies in North Africa. And you have the feeling that if you do not stop them now, they will keep advancing until there is no way to hold them back. In September of 1571, the Holy League, led by Spain, delivers a brutal defeat at the Battle of Lepanto. Don Juan de Austria, the king's illegitimate brother, commands the Christian fleet and destroys the Ottoman Armada in the Gulf of Patras in Greece. It is the most important naval victory the Christian world has seen in centuries. The Spanish sing, pray, celebrate. Cervantes fights in that battle and loses the use of his left hand. He calls it the greatest occasion the centuries have ever seen. But Philip II knows something that the celebrants on the streets of Madrid do not yet know. Lepanto was an enormous victory, but it was not the end. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet in less than a year. They have almost unlimited resources. They have tens of millions of subjects. They control the most important trade routes in the world. And Spain, no matter how powerful it is, cannot fight this war alone forever. It needs a second front. It needs someone on the other side of the map to be gnawing at the Sultan's ankles while Spain faces him across the Mediterranean. That someone was the Shah of Persia. The Safavid Persians and the Ottoman Turks hated each other with an intensity that went far beyond geopolitics. It was a religious, cultural, and historical hatred that stretched back centuries. The Ottomans were Sunni, the Persians were Shia, and this division, which today remains the central fracture of the Islamic world and explains much of what is happening in the Middle East right now, in the 16th century was an open, bleeding wound that produced wars constantly. The two empires had clashed dozens of times. They had signed and broken peace treaties as if they were paper napkins, and they were going to keep doing it. Here I want to ask you something, and I want you to write it in the comments. Did you know that Iran and Spain came close to being formal allies 4 centuries ago? Write to me if this surprised you, because I bet the majority of people watching this video have never heard this story. Your comment also helps the algorithm carry this content to more people who deserve to know it. The idea of a Hispanic-Persian alliance did not appear overnight. It took decades of letters, ambassadors, negotiations, promises, and disappointments. The first diplomatic contacts date back to the times of Ferdinand the Catholic, at the beginning of the 16th century, when Pope Leo X actively proposed that Spain and Persia coordinate simultaneous attacks against the Ottoman Empire. The idea was simple and brilliant on paper. If Spain attacked from the west, through the Mediterranean, and Persia attacked from the east, through Mesopotamia and Anatolia, the Ottomans would have to divide their forces between two fronts, and at some point the combined pressure would break them. It was the same logic the Allies used against Hitler in the Second World War, but 4 centuries earlier and with turbans instead of helmets. The problem was distance. We are talking about communication in the 16th century. A letter between Madrid and the Shah's court in Qazvin, which was the Persian capital at the time, could take between 6 months and a year to arrive. A reply took another year. By the time the two sides agreed on something, the political situation had already changed completely. The Ottomans could go from being at war with Persia to signing a truce in the time it took an ambassador to make the journey one way. It was nearly impossible coordination, and yet the two empires tried it for decades because both understood that the strategic logic was irrefutable. Throughout the second half of the 16th century, several Persian ambassadors traveled to Europe to seek military and financial support. Most of these trips ended in failure. The Europeans promised a great deal, delivered little, and the Persians returned empty-handed with the feeling that the Westerners were unreliable allies who wanted to use Persia as a shield without committing themselves in any real way. The journey was an odyssey of epic proportions. The embassy left Persia and crossed the Caspian Sea, traversed Russia, sailed through the North Sea, and finally arrived on the coasts of Western Europe after a journey that lasted more than a year. They passed through the Tsar's court in Moscow, crossed Prague, where they met with the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, and finally arrived in Valladolid, which at that moment was the de facto capital of the Spanish Empire under Philip III. At every step of the way, the Persian delegation caused a sensation. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. The clothing, the languages, the rituals, the gifts, everything carried an exoticism that the European courts of the 16th century simply did not know how to process. In Valladolid, something happened that was not in any diplomatic plan. Uric Beg, the young Georgian Persian officer who had traveled thousands of kilometers as part of Shah Abbas's mission, made a decision that would change his life forever. He converted to Catholicism. The exact reasons for this conversion are debated among historians. Some say it was genuine religious conviction. Others argue it was a strategic move, a way of earning the definitive trust of the Spanish and facilitating the negotiation. Others, the most cynical, suggest he simply fell in love with Europe and decided to stay. What we know for certain is that his baptism was a state occasion. The godfather was Philip III himself, the King of Spain. The ceremony took place in the royal palace of Valladolid, and Uric Beg, the Persian officer, came to be called Don Juan de Persia, taking the name of the legendary Don Juan de Austria, who had won Lepanto 30 years before. Think about that for a moment. A Persian prince, Muslim, raised in the court of the Shah of Iran, being baptized by the most powerful king in Western Christendom, in the most important palace in Spain, with the name of the greatest Spanish military hero of the century. If this were a film, you would say it was exaggerated, and yet it happened exactly this way. It is documented in the historical archives of Valladolid, and almost nobody knows it. Don Juan de Persia spent the following years in Spain trying to complete the mission that had brought him there. He integrated into Spanish society with surprising fluency. He learned Castilian Spanish. He wrote a memoir in Spanish that was published in 1604 and still exists, that can still be read today. That is one of the most extraordinary historical sources on life in the Persian court of the 16th century and on the experience of a foreigner in Habsburg Spain. In that book, Don Juan de Persia describes the Shah's palaces, the wars against the Ottomans, the customs of the Persians, and also his own inner journey from Islam to Catholicism. It is a unique document in the history of relations between East and West, but the diplomatic mission was failing. The alliance that Shah Abbas had sent him to negotiate never fully materialized. The The Spanish kept stalling. The Ottomans and the Safavids signed a new truce that removed the urgency from the matter, and the Persian embassy gradually lost its relevance at the Madrid court as the months passed. Hussein Ali Beg, the head of the delegation, returned to Persia with disappointing results. Don Juan de Persia, on the other hand, stayed. He had burned his bridges by converting to Catholicism. Returning to Persia as a Christian would have been, at best, an enormous problem, at worst, directly dangerous. And then came the end. In 1604, on a street in Madrid, Don Juan de Persia died in a brawl. The exact details are murky, as violent incidents of the 16th century tended to be when they did not involve figures important enough to be documented with precision. He was around 45 years old. He had left Persia forever, had abandoned his name, his religion, his family, had traveled more than 6,000 kilometers at a time when that represented years of effort and constant mortal danger. And he died in a street fight in a city that was not his own, in a country that never quite became completely his home, for a cause that never fully materialized. The Hispanic-Persian alliance, the geopolitical dream that united two of the most powerful empires in the world during a century of intense diplomacy, never became real. The Ottomans survived. Spain entered its slow decline in the 17th century. Persia went its own way. And the three powers that for so long had watched each other as pieces on the chessboard of the Mediterranean and the Middle East eventually disappeared or transformed into something completely different. What I find most fascinating about this story, and what I believe makes it absolutely worth telling today, is that the question diplomats were asking in the 16th century is exactly the same one being asked in chancelleries all over the world today. What to do about Iran? Is it an enemy or a potential ally? Is there a way to find common ground with a power that shares some interests with the West and clashes frontally with it on others? For centuries ago, Spain and Persia found a partial answer to that question. The shared enemy could create a foundation for understanding that no other factor would have produced. The answer was never perfect, never complete, and in the end it was not enough. But it came very close. And Don Juan de Persia, that man buried in Valladolid that nobody visits, is the most human and most tragic proof of how close the world came to being different. Now I need you to do something before you go. Leave me a comment with your answer to this question. If the 16th century Hispanic-Persian alliance had truly worked, do you think the world would be a better place today? Would it have changed the history of the Middle East forever? Your opinion matters to me because historians hold completely opposite positions on this. And a conversation in the comments with people who genuinely think about these questions is worth infinitely more than any algorithm. And if this video interested you, the next one you should watch is about another story that connects the past with the present in a way that was never taught to you in any class either. See you there.